Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to New Canaan Library. Before we get started, housekeeping notes, please take a moment to silence your cell phones right now, if you could, and just note the exits from the room to your right and left, behind you, directly outside, or back through the concourse. Okay. Someone coming in there? No. Okay. Well, welcome to the 2026 Attwood Lecture. This is a series that honors longtime New Canaan resident, journalist, and author William Attwood, who during his career was a speechwriter to President John F. Kennedy and ambassador to Guinea and Kenya. The Attwood Lecture presents distinguished speakers from the global fields of journalism, politics, government, and literature. That's quite a broad remit. However, tonight we're privileged to have with us author and polymath Simon Winchester, who has written over 30 nonfiction books, many of them bestsellers and award winners, including the unforgettable The Professor and the Madman, A Tale of Murder, Insanity, and the Making of the Oxford English Dictionary. Winchester attended Oxford and became a geologist. An expansively inquiring mind and thirst for travel led to a successful career in journalism before dedicating himself to writing historical nonfiction. Winchester's background and training show through in his ability to translate complex science, in his ear for a good story that others might miss, in his appetite for adversity, venturing to some of the most rugged places on earth to research the arcane and present it to us in living color, in his affection for the eccentric, his ability to embrace divergent viewpoints, and last but definitely not least, in the fluid artistry of his prose, the joy he takes in words. His new book, The Breath of the Gods, The History and Future of the Wind, is of course a cultural and political and scientific history of this powerful, invisible force that most of us rarely consider. But let me tell you, this dark horse is also a rollicking good read. One of those books that before you've ever finished, you tell any smart person you know that they will absolutely love it. And now it's my great pleasure and honor to be in conversation with the master himself. Please help me welcome Simon Winchester.
Oh, great. One of those things. Yes.
Welcome, Simon.
Well, thank you. How very nice to be here. And I can't really see if it's a nice turnout, but I was told it was, so thank you for coming.
It absolutely is.
Great.
So you began your adult work life working on oil rigs as a geologist until you realized you wanted to be a reporter, and then landed at The Guardian, where you did some incredible reporting. You were in Northern Ireland reporting on the Troubles, Bloody Sunday, you covered Watergate. And is it also true that you were accused of spying in Argentina? Was this during the Falklands?
Yes, it was during the Falklands, and funnily enough, because I was thinking, at the moment I'm sort of vaguely thinking it's maybe an appropriate time in my life to think about writing a memoir. But I mean, why would I write a memoir if my life hadn't been very interesting? But it had been interesting. And the moment I thought to myself, my life is really rather interesting, was in prison because of what you've just mentioned, the spying charges. And this was in a prison, reputedly the most southerly prison in the world, which is in the very southern tip of Tierra del Fuego in southern Argentina. And I'd been arrested for spying. And I think this was about the 50th day. I was there for 3 months, so 77 days actually. And I was standing on the end of my bunk, gazing through the barred between the bars of the rather dirty window, looking out over the harbour where there were little icebergs because it was June, the austral midwinter, and there were seals and things. And in the far distance there was Antarctica, well, there was Cape Horn, and then there was Antarctica. And it suddenly struck me, I came from a very ordinary, lower middle class English background in North London, and here I am in prison, accused of spying in Argentina. What an incredibly interesting life I've lived. Maybe one day I'll write a memoir about it.
Oh,
But that was 42 years ago, and the succeeding 42 years have been almost as interesting. No prison, though.
That's amazing that you had that thought in prison. This is not me talking. It's universally agreed upon that you can write about anything and make it interesting. And you've said in the past that behind every front door, there's a story. Is this what accounts for your transition from journalist to book-length historical narratives?
I'm not sure. I remember this adage about everyone's got a story to tell. Was when my very first newspaper was in Newcastle upon Tyne in northeast England. And there's a town, so Newcastle is on the River Tyne, and then Sunderland is on the River Wear. And in those days, no one ever went to Sunderland. No journalist would go there. It was a place you didn't inquire too much about. It was just a rather grim and grimy industrial city. But my news editor, a chap called John Ritson, said, I promise you, behind every door, there's a story. So take the company car and a photographer and go down to any random street in Sunderland and knock on every door and say to the person who opens the door, is anything interesting happening in this street? And they say, no, nothing ever happens in this street. Well, the man at number 3, he was a guard at a prison camp in Germany in the Second World War. And the chap at number 5, he swears he saw a pigeon with a human head the other day. And every street, every door, there was some bizarre allegation. And so it proved the point. John Ritson was entirely right. And so everyone in this room has got a story to tell. And it just is up to people to ask questions to find out what those stories are. So whether it aided in the transition, I enjoyed the journalistic aspect of it. But then when you get your teeth into a subject like the wind, you find all sorts of weird stories in that as well. So everywhere there are stories.
Yeah, and you needed maybe more time to tell it and go deeper.
That's the luxury of writing a book, is that you have a fairly lengthy period of time to consider it and to winkle all the good stories out.
I have to say, I confess that like your American editor, I was a little hesitant about this one until I started reading it. And I think that it's extraordinary how your sentences are so beautiful, and together they're like poetry, except for we're actually learning something very concrete. And from the very beginning, like from the first page, when you're talking about the BBC shipping news, and you make the Beaufort scale seem wonderful. I mean, it's like fairy dust. Like there's the feeling of reading that passage is like sparkly dust. Do people know what the BBC shipping news is and the Beaufort?
Shipping forecast, rather than
shipping forecast.
Shipping news was the book, if you remember it.
That's right, the BBC shipping forecast.
Well, every night on BBC Radio 4, it doesn't close down. I mean, they theoretically broadcast 24 hours a day, but all good Brits should be in bed by midnight. That's the sort of view of the controller of BBC Radio 4. And so they end the main tranche of broadcasting, but always with the shipping forecast. And basically, I can be very boring about this. I'll try not to. But if you look at a map of the British Isles and the seas around it, extending from Iceland down to the southern part of Spain, the areas of the sea are divided somewhat arbitrarily into named regions. Many of them are the names, the ones that are close to the shores of Britain, names of, I mean, like Tyne, Dogger, Dover, White.
You love the names.
I love
you write
the
in
names,
the
yeah.
books. You love these
And
names.
then the farther flung ones have names like Rockall and North Utsira, South Utsira, Trafalgar, where the great battle was, of course, with Nelson. And so we know instinctively where they are. And so the announcer will give the existing weather conditions in, let us say, Trafalgar, 5, visibility poor, rain in last hour, winds cyclonic, strengthening 5 to 7 tomorrow. And of course, if you don't know what 5 to 7 means, it is Beaufort scale 5 to Beaufort scale 7. And this is a scale where the wind is measured not by numbers in meters per second or miles per hour, but by the condition of the sea over which it blows. So if there's no wind, Beaufort 0, the sea is mirror calm. If it's Beaufort 1, there's a slight sort of stippling. 2, there are all little wavelets. 3, there are white horses on the top of the waves. And so it goes on all the way up, getting more and more violent until you get up to Beaufort 12, which is, the air is filled with spray. It's impossible to see. Even well-found ships find it difficult to navigate, and that you're in the middle of a hurricane. But so Beaufort 5, it would be a light gale, if you like. I mean, fairly robust winds. But this is where I'm going to get boring. Well, I'm not going to get boring, so I'm going to stop. But but you listen to this and you lie in bed, and the rain may be thudding on the windows, and you pull the blanket up to your chest and up to your chin, and you think, my God, I'm warm and cozy and dry in my bed, and yet out there in Trafalgar or South Utsira or Dogger or Tyne, there's a fishing boat heaving around in Beaufort 9 or something, and it's going to get worse in the morning. You think, God, thank God I'm at home, thank God I'm at bed, and those courageous men who are bringing the fish for me to eat tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
And the whole thing is inexpressibly romantic to
It
someone
is.
like me.
It really is. It's such a delicious way of opening the book, and also setting up, the idea of conditions, the conditions created by the wind. And one of the things that you do expertly in all your books is you weave together the consequences of things, the kind of serendipitous nature of the course of human history, like it's luck or something. And so you set up through this Beaufort scale the conditions that the wind creates. And one of the things that I found so intriguing was finding just how much wind had altered the course of history. So you have all these examples, that you get into. For instance, had the Persians conquered, the Greeks, when the Greeks were kind of, Greek philosophy and governance was just getting into full flower, like life would be very different for us. Or if the Spanish Armada had conquered the British Navy, when they were trying to bring the Church of England back under Rome, life could be very different. But there's a particular one that you have a personal connection with. And I wonder if you could tell us that story. It has to do with Walter Monk and the famous delay, the D-Day delay.
Yes, Walter Monk was at Stanford. He was Danish, I think, originally. But he was very interested in the connection between essentially what we were just talking about, wind and waves and the generation of waves and so forth. And he became particularly interested, despite being thousands of miles from the scene of the action, by this plan of which he had vague intimations that the Allied forces in June 1944 were likely to land an enormous force of soldiers and equipment on the Normandy beaches. And the question was, which was intriguing and indeed terrifying, the planners of this operation, not least General Eisenhower, who was the supreme commander, of how ferocious the waves would be. because you disembarked the men who were going to do the infantry, who were going to do the fighting, into these landing craft with this great steel door at the bow, which would go as far as it could towards the beaches and then drop the front door, and the men would be ordered to charge out, bearing in mind they're in thick woolen uniforms with helmets and ammunition clips and shovels and all sorts of heavy iron things which would weigh them down if the water was too deep, if the waves were too high. I mean, they would drown because there was no way they could stand up. So how high were the waves going to be on the 6 Normandy beaches in early June? Well, the weather was atrocious. I mean, not surprisingly, it's Northern Europe in summer. We know what that's like. And on this particular, D-Day was scheduled for the 5th of June, 1944. And my father was one of the many tens and tens of thousands who was supposed he was a tank commander, so he had a light tank, and he was on one of these vessels and on the landing craft preparing to go. And then the meteorologists in London noticed that there were 2 small depressions over Baffin Island in northern Canada. They looked as if they were likely to be coming towards the British Isles and towards northern Europe, and thereby stirring up the water and the wind and therefore the waves in the landing area. But they didn't know by how much. And so they asked secretly, because Monk, after all, was thousands of miles away from the action, if he could advise. And his calculations, which I think are preserved somewhere, you can actually see his pencil calculations, said it would be foolhardy to perform the operation on the 5th of June, even though all the you can imagine the thousands of aircraft and ships and men straining at the leash to go. And if you keep cancelling, the morale will go and the readiness will evaporate. And but he gave this formal suggestion to Eisenhower, delay it until the 6th of June. And to his credit, Eisenhower in the end said, well, this is a man of great distinction and he's likely to be right, so we'll delay it for 24 hours. And they did. And then, well, we all know what happened. It was a considerable success. One of the great Operation Overlord maritime engagements in military history. So for that, Walter Monk deserves an enormous amount of credit, the man who delayed D-Day. Didn't do my father much good because he was actually captured 3 days later and his tank was blown up and he was taken off to a prison camp in Braunschweig in eastern Germany, released by Americans, oddly enough, in March 1945. And without getting unduly personal about it, he returned home to England to find his house had been bombed, destroyed by a V1 doodlebug. But his wife had been evacuated to a place in Berkshire, I think it was. And what he didn't know was that I had been born. So that was his little bonus. Nice. Well, it's one of those funny stories. He arrived, he was an officer, he had a staff car which took him to this village in west of London. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, he arrived and rang the bell, and a lady came down in curlers, and she was the landlady. And is Mrs. Winchester here? Yes, she is, but be quiet, don't wake up the other evacuees. So he went upstairs, expecting, I don't mean to be unduly vulgar, but as you probably know, it is said that the second thing a soldier does on return to his wife and family is to take off his pack. Well, in this case, he opened the door, and instead of being greeted with ecstasy and delight, the first words he heard was, "Shh, don't wake up the baby."
Oh my God, yeah, life has changed.
Yeah.
It's different.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. I didn't know that. So if wind is the protagonist in this story, I think the ocean is a very strong supporting character. Certainly it's not all about the ocean, but these passages are glorious reading for anybody who knows their way around boats, especially sailboats. I have to ask, what kind of sailor are you?
Well, not a good one at all, but I did quite a lot of sailing. because in 1985, I think it was, I wanted to write a book about the last relics of the British Empire, and there are 16, or there were then, there are 15 now, because Hong Kong has become part of People's Republic of China now. And I wanted to go in particular to Diego Garcia, which is in the middle of the Indian Ocean. You're not allowed to go there. But I put it around the community that's interested in Diego Garcia and the fate of the people that used to live there but were casually booted off by the British and American governments so that America could build an enormous and critically very important air base on the island. I put it around that one day I'd like to go if there was an opportunity. And I remember vividly, I was sitting having breakfast in Oxford, and telephone rang, a chap called John Madeley, who ran an organization called the Minority Rights Group. And he said, "You want to go to Diego Garcia? Well, there's a woman who's doing a round-the-world single-handed sailing trip. She's Australian, and she's in Cochin in southwest India. Maybe you could get in touch with her because she wants to go, but she's afraid of going alone because she knows it's illegal to go there." So I knew her name. It was called Ruth Boydell. And this, oddly enough, I'm very interested in telephones and the codes that are used to connect different countries to one to another. And they had just announced that you could, I know in America you dial 011 to get out, but in Britain it's 001 to get out of Britain. And then you dial the country code. The country code for India is 91, whereas country code for America is 1, country code for Britain is 44. But 91, and you could dial the big cities, Calcutta, Madras, Delhi, Bombay. But there was no indication you could dial a little place like Cochin. But I happen to know the code for dialing Cochin inside India. And I also happen to know the name of the nicest hotel in Cochin, which was called the Bolgati Palace, which was on the sea. So I thought, well, I never met this woman, never seen her boat, but she had a gaff-rigged steel schooner, 2 masts if it's a schooner, and it was painted green. So I thought maybe if I could somehow get in touch with the hotel, they might find Ruth. So I dialed 011,
Oh my gosh.
91, whatever the long number for. Am I boring you?
No, I can't believe it.
Well,
you are the most tenacious
No.
man.
Dialed the number for Cochin and then dialed the Bolgati Palace. And sure enough, after squeaks and rattles, I heard dring, 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 dring. And a voice answered, "Hello," an obviously Indian voice. So I said, "Oh, hello, is that the Bolgati Palace?" "Yes, it is." I said, "I'm looking for a green yacht with 2 masts, which should be sitting at anchor outside your hotel. It's skippered by an Australian woman called," and he interrupted me. He said, "Ruth?" I said, he said, "Well, I'm the bartender here, and she's sitting in front of me with a beer. Let me give you." And so he gave me the receiver, and hello. And I said, "Oh, you don't know me from Adam, but my name is Simon. I'm calling from Oxford in England. And I understand you want to go to Diego Garcia." And she said, "Oh, yeah, you want to come?" And I said, anyway, so we went. We got there. It was highly illegal. We got into all sorts of trouble, but we went there. And so I sailed. So I'm a sailor. I sailed, never having been on anything other than a sunfish or something at school, from Cochin to the Maldives, down through the doldrums to Diego Garcia, and then west.
Wait, just you and Ruth?
Yeah,
you had
yeah,
only
yeah.
sailed on a sunfish and you did this?
Yeah.
Okay.
But she taught me everything. And then
You're a fast
wonderfully,
learner.
she taught me, because she didn't have a radio or anything like that, she taught me navigation. I mean, using the sun. And she, ruthless, well, her name was Ruth, but she was a ruthless person, as it turned out. And so to get from Diego Garcia to Mauritius is about 2,500 miles. And she said, "Okay, Simon, it's up to you. This is how I've taught you how to get the sun and use the sextant and all the rest of it. Get us to Mauritius." And first, I mean, you look at the chart, and the people that do sail, you know all about cocked hats and things like that. But slowly, the lines, my pencil lines, started to come together. And after about 6 or 7 days, I was making a fair fist of it. And then after about 2 weeks, she said, "Where are we?" And I said, "Well, I think," she said, "I don't want to hear, I think, where are we?" I said, "Okay, at 2 a.m., fine on the port bow, you will see the lighthouse at Port St. John's in northern Mauritius, winking, 2 flashes, too short, too long." She said, "Good, let's see." And so she stayed up, and at about 3 o'clock, I was late, we saw the lighthouse, and we knew we had navigated.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
And entirely by the wind. I mean, it was the only
How did the
propulsion we
wind
had.
treat you?
Treated us extremely well. It's treated us very badly when we then went from there to the South African coast. And when you have to go down the Transkei, which is on the way to Cape Town and rounding into the Atlantic Ocean, then you get this phenomenon of nearly all the craft to hug the coast, which is unlit. I think there are 3 lighthouses between Durban and Port St. John's, or Port Elizabeth, I think. And so it's an unlit, dangerous coast with a very fierce current coming up from the Antarctic and wicked southeasterly winds. And so you get these things like phenomenal waves which break off the noses of oil tankers and things. So it's dangerous. And I remember I was on watch late one night, and I could see, it did have a radio. I bought her a radio in Durban Yacht Club. So I had a radio. I was sort of terrified because there was an enormous ship coming behind me. We were doing about 3 knots, and this was making about 18 knots, and you could see it bearing down on me. I'm in a huge 50, 60,000 ton bulk carrier. And I radioed saying, this is the name of our yacht, was Sketty Bell. Nothing. If there was anyone on watch on the bridge, he didn't care. And he would not notice us. There might be a bit of scratch on the paintwork when he arrived in Cape Town, but we would have been he wouldn't even felt the collision. So I kept saying, "Sketty Bell, I'm on your starboard bow." And then I heard, "Sketty Bell, don't worry, I can see you." Watch me turning, and I saw this mighty ship turning. So he came in between me and the coast, and I could breathe again.
Oh, that's great.
It's a great feeling.
So
I'm sorry, I'm talking about...
No, I love it. I love it. I could do this for days. When you turn away from the ocean and go back to land, it's like a full circle moment coming back to your roots as a geologist, because we come against the fossil fuel industry, curiously enough, and I'm talking about wind power in the 1880s. Do you want to talk a little bit about Scotland, what happened there with wind power, James?
Yes, I do. I mean, I have forgotten the name briefly.
James Blythe.
That's right, Blythe.
But the fossil fuel industry really let him have it too. They were very powerful then too.
Blythe was a professor of engineering at university in Glasgow. I think it's Strathclyde University now. And this was 1875 or so, thereabouts. Mm-hmm. And we already knew, ever since the beginning of the 19th century, that if you rotate a copper coil between the poles of a magnet, you'll generate electricity. So we knew how to generate electricity. And he also knew, because Edison had just invented it, the proper filament for a light bulb. So he knew he could, by rotating a coil, he could create something an invisible force that would illuminate a light bulb. So he decided to see if wind could be used to generate electricity. And so he built a windmill. It was on a vertical axis, so it rotated that way rather than a horizontal axis like a normal, grain grinding windmill. And he built it. He had a cottage in a place called Marykirk on the Aberdeenshire coast. And he built the world's first electricity generating wind turbine. And it generated so much electricity, it was so efficient. He collected it all in Leclanche cells, in sort of batteries, and then connected those to the light bulbs. And he was, that evening, reading and by not candlelight, that's the point, by electric light, dining by electric light. There was no gloom in his house anymore, brilliantly lit. And he thought, this is wonderful, he said. So I'll go down the street and offer it to the neighbours. I'll say, look, I can give you batteries full of wind-generated electricity and bulbs.
Because he had figured out how to store it. He knew how to store the power. And
he was afraid of connecting the generator directly to the bulbs because you get sudden bursts of wind which would blow out the bulb's filament. And he went down the street and said, look, I'd like to give you this because I'm happy as Larry with the illumination in my house. And to a man, they said, oh, no, Mr. Blythe, it's very nice of you to offer, but no, it's the work of the devil. The electricity generated by wind is, no, the only way to generate electricity is from steam generated by burning coal. That's what the coal miners' companies who dotted the landscape nearby said. No, the fossil fuel industry of Scotland in the 1870s successfully quashed wind power, which didn't really become a serious thing. There was an attempt by a gentleman in Ohio to do it. And basically until the 1940s in Massachusetts, there was no wind generation for a long, long time, all because of a force which still exists today, and which is very evident in the White House, regrettably today, which is oil and coal. Fossil fuels still dominate the electricity generation system.
So history repeats itself.
History does, yes. He was very prescient, or it was very prescient. And the only public building in Marykirk in Scotland which ever had wind generator was a lunatic asylum.
There's also a nice, you talk about how also on land, FDR's big idea had to do with wind. And it wasn't so much a big idea, it was a very simple idea. It's such an elegant, simple idea. Could you tell us what that big idea was?
Yes, it was basically, thanks to John Deere and the steel blade of the plough, the topsoil of the prairies was ripped up by incoming farmers, and it led inevitably to the Dust Bowl because the wind was coming down from the Rockies, these katabatic winds on their way, all westerlies towards the Mississippi, and they picked up this newly eroded soil and turned it into these enormous dust clouds, dust storms, and devastated life in the Midwest. You only have to look at the beginning of The Grapes of Wrath, the famous Steinbeck book, and many other books, Stoner and Wallace Stegner books about the Midwest. Devastating time. How do you stop the dust from being blown away? The livelihood of the potential farmers lies, of course, in the soil, but if there's no soil, then there's no farming. How to keep the soil there? Well, Roosevelt, who has many faults, and I criticize him for many, many things, but not for this one thing. He decided he would plant trees, thousands, millions. As it turned out, 220 million trees were planted in long north-south lines from West Texas, Panhandle, Oklahoma, all the way up to North Dakota to provide what he called a shelter belt. And the shelter belts of the prairies did the trick. They inhibited the winds. I mean, we live on a little farm in Massachusetts. We have a small shelter belt of pine trees, which does indeed protect the house from the westerlies. Well, this was on a grand scale. And he got the Civilian Conservation Corps to actually dig the holes and put in the saplings. I always think the CCC is one of the great unsung organizations of this country, that unemployed young men were employed to do hard manual labor. They lived in tented encampments. And the deal was, and I forget the precise numbers, but let's say they were paid $1 a day, of which they had to give 50 cents to their mothers. And I just thought that idea of spreading the wealth upstream to the family was brilliant. Anyway, the children of the youngsters of the CCC planted the trees. I found the first one, which was, I think it was an elm or a pine maybe. It's oddly enough, it's in And the historical plaque telling its story is in the tiny, essentially abandoned town in Oklahoma where it exists. The town is called Willow, Oklahoma, but it was not a willow tree. I thought it should have been, or they should change the name of the town. But anyway, millions of trees, 220 million trees, and that was in 1934-35, superintended by the Department of Agriculture, of course, and the Dust Bowl was effectively over by 37-38, so they worked. It was a brilliant government scheme which did actually work.
So what happened to the shelter belt?
Oh, they're still there. You can see them. In fact, I first heard about this because a friend of ours who lives in the village in Massachusetts where we live grew up in South Dakota, I think, and he just casually mentioned. I'd never heard the term. He said, "Oh yes, there's a shelter belt at the end of our." What's a shelter belt? Well, did you not know what FDR did?
Nice.
So it was thanks to a neighbour. And I should also mention, although maybe you are going to mention, the other thing that a wind-related gift we were given by in South Dakota. There was a farmer in a place called Scotland, South Dakota. This is when the Dakota territories hadn't been divided into North and South Dakota. And this farmer he was Mr. Henry Schatz, his name was, an immigrant from Germany. And he was planting alfalfa, or I forget, something pretty unromantic, and it didn't make him much money. But he read that it was possible to plant flax. And so he had a seed catalogue from a dealer in St. Paul, I think. And he wrote to them, what's the deal? I'd like to buy £100 of Formium tenax, which is New Zealand flax. And they said, yes, we can send you a bag of it. It'll take about 6 months. So it comes, and it arrived eventually on the platform of the railway station that existed in Scotland, South Dakota. The railway was actually for the gold mines of the Badlands of the Dakotas. It connected Milwaukee to the Badlands. Anyway, eventually this bag of flaxseed arrived and he sowed it. And within it, and the forensic scientists have determined that 6 of the seeds were not flax seeds. They were seeds, and he should have known better in a way, one might have said, since the bag came from Odessa on the Black Sea. They were seeds of Ukrainian or Russian thistle, which grew
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
They grew quite sturdily at first. It was a green, rather lush plant. And the cattle, they ate it, not enthusiastically, but they ate it. But by October of that planting year, where flax was growing all over the place, but this turned into a hard and spiky ball, which by October broke off. It was about a 3-foot diameter ball of spikes and started being blown by the wind to reseed itself. Each ball of what we now know is tumbleweed contains about 250,000 seeds.
It's a terrible story.
And so these things
so
were
hard
bouncing.
to read this in the book.
And now the awful thing is, I mean, yes, for years, of course, it was an icon of the Western movie, you know, big man with 6 guns and
It's terrible.
tumbleweed. But now, with all these new developments, in which, and the bane of the delight for the tumbleweed, of course, but the bane of their existence, cul-de-sacs in modern houses with these developments. And the cul-de-sacs are often facing into the sunset to give the owners of the houses an attractive view. But the wind blows into the cul-de-sacs, bringing with it hundreds, thousands of tumbleweeds, which often these innocent people from, I don't know, Chicago or New York who have moved, having read books about the romance of the Midwest, suddenly find they can't leave their houses because there's a great wall of impenetrable spikes of tumbleweed invasions. And the only thing that will ease the problem is either the town will bring dumpsters to haul this stuff away or goats. And so village associations hire 18-wheelers, and you open the door and goats spill out, and they'll eat anything, of course, including tumbleweeds. But from Mr. Schatz's Odessa flax, something initially romantic, and utter wind-borne menace.
It's just incredible. The book is full of this. I kid you not. I mean, that story was so difficult to read, but my eyes just kept getting wider and wider. It was like, it's just, I don't want to give any more away. How many people have read the book already here? Show of hands. Okay, not, all right. So a lot of people have not read it yet. I'm telling you, you need to read it. We're going to go to Q&A, but I have one more question, and we're going to start out the Q&A a little differently tonight. I have to ask, Simon, you have published over 30 nonfiction books. Is it 36? Am I right? 36, and one novel. So what happened there? What happened there? What was it writing? What was it like writing a novel? Who read it?
Well, it is a novel no one should read.
Okay.
So, I mean, just for the record, it exists. Basically, a publisher in London had this brilliant idea that he would ask 6 generals from NATO to write a fiction book on how, this was sometime in the 80s, I think, how the Third World War would break out. And that book did reasonably well. It was published by Macmillan in London. And then he turned to me and said, okay, why don't you, I think I was living in Hong Kong at the time, why don't you write a book on what, looking at it from a historical point of view, sometime in the middle of the 21st century, what happened after Hong Kong reverted Chinese rule in 1997. So I came up with a naive and fanciful and juvenile account of all sorts of mayhem breaking out between various Asian countries. And it was a disaster. So that's as much as I want to say about it.
Okay, thank you for answering that. So we're going to go to audience Q&A, but before the audience asks its questions, Simon has a question for our audience.
Well, I do really, and I just sort of refreshed. My wife and I watched it 2 nights ago. I don't know if anyone's brave enough to answer this question, but I want to know how New Canaan has been dealing in the last quarter century with the ice storm. You knew it was going to be ice. I mean, I just think it's such a sad, sad film. I love Ang Lee as a director, very, very clever film. But he was so specific. It wasn't a generic New England town. It was New Canaan, Connecticut.
I mean, it was, he was talking about the pharmacy Varnums. Because the author grew up in New Canaan. Rick Moody grew up in New Canaan.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, generally speaking, are you glad it was made? Do you regret it was made? Is it was it right? Was it horrible? Was
it right? Who participated
yes,
in the key parties?
Will Sigourney Weaver please stand up?
Yeah, please.
There's a very famous book in England. I don't think many people will have read it in America, by a chap called Laurie Lee, called Cider with Rosie. And there's this wonderful scene. It's a memoir of his growing up in absolutely idyllic circumstances of dire poverty in a village in Gloucestershire. And Rosie, large of thigh and huge of breast, teaches him under a hay wain, I think, the rudiments of romance and life and so forth. And we never quite know who Rosie is. But anyway, he became famous for many other books. Cider with Rosie remains his greatest success. It's still in print. But there was a memorial service to him. I think he died at about the age of 90 and buried in the churchyard in the village where he grew up. So it's very, very local. But the person that was talking about his life to an audience this kind of size said, we understand Rosie is still alive and among us. Perhaps now is the moment for the real Rosie to stand up. 4 elderly women stood up. I commend it. It's a wonderful book. Do read it if you can.
Okay, can we have some questions? We have somebody up here. Just wait for my colleague to to get the mic because we're recording this and we want to hear your question on the recording.
First of all, there are no more keys being used for cars. It's all push button starts. So that answers your ice storm. I want to ask you.
Can you hold up the mic to?
Sure. I want to ask you how you found the story of the professor and the madman. How did you stumble onto that situation?
Well, it was quite interesting. I had come newly back from Hong Kong in 1997, and I had written a book about the Yangtze River, traveling up that, and I was at a bit of a loose end about what I was going to do, but I decided I wanted to write about the romance of tramp steamers, in other words, small cargo vessels that were rapidly being replaced by large container ships doing regular and rather boring maritime routes. So the idea that I had was to, with a group of like-minded friends, was to actually buy one of these ships and work it as a working. There were a lot of them laid up in the Baltic, and I thought for $150,000 or so you could buy a sort of rust bucket and then clean it up and drive it around the world, picking up cargo and just, for a couple of years, going London to London or New York to New York. It would make a very romantic book, I thought. And one foolish publisher agreed that it would and advanced me some money to do it and buy the ship and so forth. And I think it must have been summertime, she invited me to lunch on 18th Street in New York. And then, as is traditional, brought me back to her office to show me the books that she was publishing that autumn. And one of them was a book by a chap called Jonathan Green called Chasing the Sun, Dictionaries and the Men Who Made Them. And because I had already bought an OED in Hong Kong, 12-volume, 13-volume OED, and I liked dictionaries, I thought, well, that'd be interesting. So I took it up. I had a little cottage in upstate New York then, and was reading it in bed and was completely transfixed by it. It was a very well-written and very, very good book. And then the next morning, I was so entranced by this that I took it and read it in my morning bath. So then I came across this line which said, readers of this book, a specialized book, will of course be familiar with the story of W.C. Minor, the deranged American lunatic murderer who was such a prolific contributor to the OED. I'd never heard this story, and I sat up in the bath and, like sort of Archimedes, I had a touch-tone telephone on the bath caddy in front of me and remembered the telephone number of the one lexicographer I knew, who was a woman called Elizabeth Knowles, across in Oxford. So I dialed 01144 when I told you I was interested in telephone numbers, 1-865-56767. And sure enough, it rang and rang and rang, and it didn't answer. And I was about to hang up when suddenly this exasperated voice at the other said, yes. And I said, Elizabeth, this is Simon Winchester, and I'm calling, and I hope there are no strange noises, from my bath in America. Do you know anything about someone called W.C. Minor? And she said, well, funnily enough, I do, probably more than anyone else in the world, because I wrote a paper on his contributions to the OED for a magazine, a quarterly, published in Madison, Wisconsin, called, somewhat unimaginatively, Dictionaries. And if you towel yourself dry, get out of your bath towels, go up to your fax machine, which we had in those days, I'll fax it over to you. And so she did, and I looked most interested at the bibliography at the end, and there was no book about this fellow. So I thought I'll write a book about it, and everyone was against it, including the publisher of the tramp steamer. She said, no, this is just an article for the New Yorker or the Smithsonian or some magazine like that. But a publisher, sadly now dead, called Larry Ashmead, who worked for HarperCollins, saw the proposal I had written on the end of a desk in London. He was passing through London looking for properties. And he said to the editor on whose desk it was, what's this, a story about murder and madness, making of the OED? Oh, that's by Winchester. He lives in America. You may know of him. I was just throwing it away because he's not doing it because his publisher in America won't do it. And Larry said, let me read it on the plane going back. And Larry did and read it and commissioned it. And the rest, 27 years later, is history. That book completely changed my life. And Larry Ashmead changed my life.
Fantastic.
Well, I was jolly lucky. It took no time at all to write because it was such a good story.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Except there's a coda to that. And I hope you'll excuse the bad language in this. Jonathan Green became a good friend of mine, the chap who wrote Chasing the Sun. And he published, and still in print, Green's Dictionary of Slang, 3 volumes dictionary. And we were asked by the BBC to do an interview together in his library, which is a very large library in London, full of dictionaries. So we're sitting down in this shrine to lexicography, and the young woman producer is doing the tape recorder thing, just about to switch on the recording, and Jonathan says to her, would you mind, I need to say something to Simon before the recording begins. And she says, of course. And he leans over and he says, Simon, he says, fuck you. And I said, why? He said, well, I wrote Deranged American Lunatic Murderer. You wrote the book. Why didn't I write the book? So, but he's been very sweet ever since. We get on well.
Okay, another question? All the way in the back.
Yeah, I'd like to answer what you asked about the ice storm, because I grew up here and I'm older than Rick Moody. When I was overseas, people used to ask me questions, and my reply is something my mother used to say. The town was very much like Peyton Place, and associations and people that I grew up with. The story is pretty accurate, not only about the weather, about the people.
Really?
Okay. Do we have another question? There's one up here. Let's see how many we can squeeze in. Okay.
Thank you. I'm just, we're all aware of the effects of climate change on, obviously, air temperature, greater ocean acidification, the possible reduction or elimination of the great ocean currents like the Gulf Stream. One thing I don't know much about or anything about is the effect of climate change on wind. Are the patterns changing? Is it becoming more reliable, the currents less reliable? I wonder if you could address that at all.
Well, thank you for asking that. That's the reason I wrote the book in the first place, which is I'd read a piece in The Guardian, the paper I used to work for, sometime maybe about 3 years ago, saying that the world was in the midst of a new meteorological phenomenon, the great terrestrial stilling, because statistics from both Europe and North America showed that the average wind speed, for some mysterious reason, had declined in the first 15 years of this millennium by 10%. I mean, you think storms are getting fiercer, hurricanes more frequent, tornadoes and so on and so forth. That may well be true. But the average wind speed was, at the time that this piece was published, slowing down. And why was that? Well, all sorts of fanciful reasons were put forward. One was that the planet Earth, and this didn't relate to the wind speed over the oceans, which was unchanged, but over the continental part of the planet, it is said that and this seemed to me to be not a sensible answer at all, it was getting more interrupted by high buildings and cities, and obviously New York City will create a sort of shelter belt of its own, and other cities with skyscrapers interrupt the flow of wind. But that didn't seem a very good answer. The only decent answer seemed to be that it was a phenomenon probably brought about by the relative, if you count the temperature in Kelvin rather than Celsius or Fahrenheit, the relative sort of, what am I trying to say? Well, global warming, that the poles are getting warmer, that equator's getting even hotter, but that the actual relative change of temperature is actually smaller than it was 25, 30, 40 years ago. That seemed to be something that you could put forward a theory about wind speed. And people were busily doing research to see if this was true, and you could link the stilling to climate change. But then something most inconvenient happened, which was that about a decade ago, stilling ceased to be a phenomenon. And the new phenomenon we're said to be in the grip of is the great terrestrial reacceleration. So it's all nonsense. And but thankfully the piece was published in The Guardian, which enabled me to say, it'd be an interesting topic to have a look at. And despite the skepticism of my editor, who, as you rightly say, Mickey, wasn't terribly keen at first, I think she came aboard later.
Do we have one more? We have time for one more.
Thank you for coming this evening. You've written over a period of time so many nonfiction books. How many of them, when you look back at them, hold up versus don't hold up because the technology or the science has changed, you've come to different conclusions?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, there are some books which are obviously juvenilia, and I best forget the novel being a classic of its kind. But most of them, oddly enough, are still in print. I mean, one can be very cynical about the publishing world, that initially my books briefly appeared in a bookstore and then died. But then after The Professor and the Madman came along, many of these books were exhumed and enjoyed a new sort of post-mortem life, if I can put it like that. And I think my book on Northern Ireland, which was called In Holy Terror, still sort of stands up because, as Churchill said, after the great flood recedes, the one thing which will emerge from the waters are the cathedrals of Fermanagh and Tyrone, because in the integrity of their argument is eternal. So that book, even though written in 1974, the sort of observations that this young journalist made still obtain, because the argument is exactly the same in Northern Ireland as it was when Cromwell went there in 1644. So nothing has changed. So, I mean, some books, I wrote a book about the American Midwest, which, yes, no one should read that. That is not in print. And there was a book about the British aristocracy, which was reissued a few years ago as a guide to what's the difference, how to tell a marquis from a viscount, for people that watched Downton Abbey. So some books have gone that way.
Krakatoa is a big one.
Krakatoa, that remains.
That's a big one.
Yeah, that's a big one. So a big beast. But technology has, for instance, I did a book on precision engineering, and that sells quite robustly.
And knowing what we know?
Yes, I think that's even that. I mean, that was a difficult book to write, and it was during COVID and so forth, and so research was a bit difficult to do. But it's a lovely question, and thank you for asking it. But most of them have escaped by the skin of their teeth, but they still exist, I think.
Simon, I wish I could continue this conversation. There's so many things. You could give directions for how to get to the bathroom, and we would listen, We're so grateful for you coming out here tonight. This has been a wonderful conversation. Simon's going to be signing books over here at the Elm Street Books table. If you'd like to buy your copy, he'll happily sign it and personalize it for you. Thank you so much, Simon, and thank you all for coming tonight.